Good morning, I'm Erica Hill.
And I'm Jim Sciutto. Happening right now, the Biden administration is preparing for what could be a tense phone call between President Biden and the Chinese President Xi Jinping. As the question remains, will China support or resist Russia's invasion of Ukraine or try to remain neutral? We will be live at the White House in just a moment. Back on the ground in Ukraine, intense shelling by Russian forces pushes the Russian army significantly west.
An air raid siren has just gone off here in western Ukraine in Lviv. We're hearing some explosions here in the background, and there was an air raid siren that went off just a few minutes ago. So we're going to have to wrap it up from our location here.
At least 6 munitions, possibly missiles, rained down near the city of Lviv in the west of Ukraine. The mayor there says several of them struck an aircraft repair plant. We should note, Erica, that's just miles from the Polish border.
Yeah, absolutely. In an area you know well, having spent several weeks there, Jim. In the capital city of Kyiv, meantime, at least one person is dead, several others injured as Russian forces continue to target residential areas. We also have new details this morning about the first U.S. citizen killed in Ukraine. James Whitney Hill's sister says he was known as a helper. Jimmy Hill was in Ukraine for medical treatment for his partner. He was killed as Russian shelling slammed the northern city of Chernihiv.
The civilians bearing so much of the cost of this war. We are covering every angle of the breaking news as only CNN can. Our reporters, correspondents, analysts standing by to bring you the latest from across the world. CNN international correspondent Scott McLean is in Lviv, Ukraine. And Scott, you and I there for a long time, and really seldom did the missiles reach that far, but now more and more they're coming in that direction. What did you see? What did you hear?
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Jim. You'll remember air raid sirens were a daily occurrence, sometimes several times daily occurrence, but it seemed like people here were pretty desensitized to them. If you're out on the streets, no longer do you really see people shuffling off to the shelters as quickly as you can, as you did in the first few days of war, because nothing has hit inside this city, that is, until today. The air raid sirens went off early this morning. It was minutes later that an explosion was heard even from here in central Lviv. And then, of course, we could see the thick black smoke on the horizon. We were quickly able to figure out that it was near the airport. We went out to that area. And early on, we were able to get a good vantage point from a bridge right at the end of the airport runway there. And you could see that there was a building on fire just beyond that runway. That, we understand from local officials, is that airport or that airplane repair facility that was hit. Incredibly, the governor's office says that only one person was hurt, but not even badly. So now the question is, now that you have so many people who've been fleeing violence elsewhere in the country ending up in Lviv, the question is, will people start to leave? I spoke to some of the people who were on the scene. One man who witnessed the bombing early this morning. Here's what he told me.
There were some explosions. I heard the noise, and then I looked right away and I saw a column of smoke rising.
Even with bombing, you feel safe to stay here?
Well, I don't know. Where would I go?
And that is the question a lot of people are asking. And Jim and Eric, I just want to point out quickly where I am right now. So these strollers or buggies or prams, they are here for a reason. They have been put here, we understand, by a Ukrainian group that is advocating on behalf of displaced people and refugees. And each of these strollers represents one child that has been killed in this conflict. According to the Ukrainians, there have been well over 100 of them, and if you can just imagine, each one of those strollers could be your own kid, could be your niece, your nephew. There's a very profound human impact of this war. The local governor said that the Russians ought to have known that Lviv has become a safe haven for so many people in this country. And he said that it just goes to show you that the Russians aren't fighting a war against the military. They are fighting a war against ordinary civilians, as we're seeing more and more of them killed. Guys?
Yeah. we are certainly seeing those attacks directly on civilians repeatedly. Scott, thank you. Amid the ongoing attacks, President Biden set to hold a call with Chinese President Xi Jinping this hour. Our team is covering both sides of this critical conversation. We want to begin here in the U.S. with White House correspondent Arlette Saenz. So, Arlette, the White House has said, look, this is going to be direct, it'll be candid, and they expect it could get tense. What are the assurances that President Biden is hoping to walk away with this morning?
Well, Erica, President Biden's goals in this call with Chinese President Xi Jinping are twofold. One, he wants to send a warning that there will be consequences if China does aid Russia in any way amid its invasion of Ukraine. But also, the call will give President Biden an opportunity to glean more information, more insight into China's viewpoint when it comes to Russia and Ukraine. This will be the first time that Biden and President Xi Jinping are speaking since November, and it comes as U.S. officials have really been watching this relationship between Xi Jinping and Russia's President Vladimir Putin with growing concern, as China has yet to denounce Russia's actions when it comes to Ukraine. Now, the U.S., one area that they are watching very closely is whether China might comply with Russia's request to provide assistance, military assistance to the country amid its invasion. U.S. officials have told allies that they have seen indications that China may be willing to do so in small forms, things like providing meals or ammunitions. Additionally, the U.S. is watching whether China will try to help Russia economically amid those punishing sanctions from the West. Yesterday, Secretary of State Antony Blinken said that President Biden would make clear to China that China will, quote, bear responsibility for any actions it takes to support Russia's aggression. He also said that the U.S. would not hesitate to impose costs on China if it does so, but officials so far have yet to outline what those costs might amount to. But bottom line here, this is a consequential call, not just for what's happening between Russia and Ukraine, but also the fate of ties between the U.S. and China, two of the world's greatest global powers.
Thanks so much, Arlette. Let's go to Shanghai now. Our David Culver is standing by. Publicly, Beijing has tried to strike something of a balance here, though at times it has endorsed Russia's positions in Ukraine. Do we expect Beijing to clear up where it stands on this war?
Yeah, Jim, they're trying to play this neutral ground, but the reality is that the longer this war goes on, the more difficult it is for President Xi in holding that position. You know, China's frequent target in all of this has been one country, not Russia, not Ukraine, the U.S. And they've repeatedly acknowledged, as you pointed out, Russia's so-called legitimate security concerns. And domestically, when you look at propaganda here, it's essentially the Chinese version of what the Kremlin is putting out. So they're helping each other spread disinformation. But what China is now navigating very carefully is feeling the economic pressure from sanctions that have been put on Russia. And that might help explain some recent actions taken by China that, quite frankly, are probably not sitting well with Putin. I want to show you some of them right now, including China's doubling the ruble trading range against the Chinese yuan. That essentially allows the ruble to continue plummeting. China also reportedly refused to send aircraft parts to Russia. And Beijing-based investment banks have halted programs in Russia and Belarus. But Washington and the EU, they want to see more done. And how they engage China is going to be key in all of this, because Arlette laid out that they're going to relay some of the consequences if they were to help Russia. But China does not respond well to being told what to do, especially when they're balancing this idea of betraying their neighbor, their ideological allegiance to a fellow autocracy, so as to side with the West. But in siding with the West, Jim, we know they may also be protecting the Chinese economy, which has slowed dramatically. Right now, there are more lockdowns in place, including what we're in right now here in Shanghai. So they're feeling the economic pressures. And if there to be more of that, economic instability, as you well know, is perhaps social instability. So they're navigating this very carefully.
It's a great point. No permanent allies, only permanent interests, and economic interests primary to China.
Right.
David, great point. Yeah.
David, Arlette, thank you both. We want to bring in now CNN Global Affairs analyst and Time Magazine contributor Kim Dozier. Kim, as we look at this, if we pick up where David left off, this very delicate threading of the needle, which is going to happen in the conversation today. China doesn't like to be told what to do, and yet there are the potential for these serious consequences. We don't have the details on those. We did hear, though, from the Chinese ambassador to Ukraine saying, we will never attack Ukraine. We're here to help. How do we balance all of this? I mean, what do you realistically expect to come out of this call?
Beijing is going to try to maintain its either-or status, and Biden is going to push them to choose a side. And as the weeks go on in this battle, it's going to get harder to stay with a foot in both camps. Because think back to the Olympics when China and Russia announced a limitless relationship. Surely behind closed doors, when Putin briefed Xi on this upcoming military operation, he described it as a special military operation that will be over and done very quickly. He looked like a rising, savvy leader who could be part of this new offensive ideologically against the United States in the West. Now he's becoming a global pariah, economically and embattled, it seems, even in his own country, the way he's lashing out at people who were his allies in that recent speech. So now Beijing has to measure, is it going to be worth the potential economic pain? Secondary sanctions haven't kicked in yet, but those could really impact China and Europe, the U.S. and ASEAN countries who largely are honoring these moves against Russia. They're China's largest trading partners. So what I'm watching for is when China starts distancing, well, if it starts distancing itself from Putin, then he's really politically finished.
Kim, you look at these measures that David Culver was delineating there, allowing the ruble to fall further, denying aircraft parts to Russia, and keeping its banks, at least one of its banks, out of Russia and Belarus. Those sound to me like sanctions. I mean, certainly nothing close to the degree of U.S. and Western sanctions on Russia, but those aren't just neutral steps. Those are negative steps, are they not, from China towards Russia?
Negative steps, but doable. It's not cutting Russia off entirely. It's trying to give Beijing a midway, a middle ground, so that they can side with Ukraine without totally cutting Moscow off.
When we look at, as Arlette pointed out, we don't know exactly what these, quote, costs would be to China, the consequences that the White House has warned about. But what's interesting is what worked very well, right, is bringing all of these allies and partners together when it came to sanctions against Russia and getting everybody on board. It's not clear yet, as we heard from Wendy Sherman earlier this morning, it's not clear who else may be on board for these, quote, consequences for China. How important is that?
Well, the problem is, as sweeping as the sanctions sound right now, Europe is still buying $1 billion worth of fuel from Russia every day. That is keeping this war machine going. So it's going to take weeks, if not months, for Moscow to really feel the pain from this concerted effort across a number of allies and partners. And we don't know if Ukraine has that long. Yes, Russian forces are stalled, but reinforcements are apparently on the way. And with a new group of Russian soldiers, they could start pushing ahead again. Meanwhile, what the Ukrainian military has to do is buy time for those sanctions to bite and for something to happen in Moscow so that Putin relents.
Kim, question. Going into this, the concern had been, what message does China take regarding Taiwan from Russia's invasion of Ukraine? We've seen the world come together with punishing economic sanctions on Russia for the invasion, as well as military support to Ukrainian forces. Does this give China pause about any ambitions it has for invading, taking over Taiwan?
Well, Beijing is probably wary watching this, though I'm sure Chinese politicians are telling themselves Taiwan is a different case. But that's another thing that you bring that up. They've got to try to keep Russia on side to vote with them in the UN Security Council in case of a move on on Taiwan in the future.
Headquarters in Brussels, those losses, there's a lot of talk about how those losses may be impacting the situation on the ground in Ukraine right now, Natasha.
Yeah, Erica, and what Western intelligence and military officials are telling us is that they believe that the losses have contributed to sagging morale within the Russian troops, that they believe that this has, because of how many troops they've lost, up to 10,000 in some estimates, they believe that this has become difficult for them to maintain. We've seen them stalling around certain areas, including in their attack on Kyiv, which has been stalled for a number of days and weeks now, and as well in the eastern part of the country as they try to move westward, they have stalled. So this is having an impact on the ground, they believe. But it's important to remember that this is not only a ground operation, right? This is also a Russian they're conducting airstrikes, they are launching missiles. So whether or not the losses are actually impacting the morale, it remains unclear how that's actually going to affect the overall Russian military operation in the country. Now, we're also told that this has had an impact on their ability to actually resupply forces. They're having difficulty kind of replenishing their troops, and they are trying to get new troops from as far afield as the Pacific. They're recruiting from Syria. They're recruiting certain mercenary groups. So they clearly are having some trouble resupplying here. But at the same time, it's not only the Russians that have suffered losses, obviously, it's also the Ukrainians, and there's no real good picture of how many Ukrainians soldiers have lost their lives over the last month of this war either. It's been difficult for the intelligence community to pinpoint one way or another how many of those forces have actually died. But ultimately, what the U.S. and Western intelligence officials tell us is that they believe that Russian President Vladimir Putin is not deterred, that he still believes, despite all of these losses, that he can take, I should say, the entire country of Ukraine. Jim, Erica.
Natasha Bertrand in Brussels, thanks so much. Joining us now to discuss, CNN military analyst, retired Air Force Colonel Cedric Leighton. Cedric, good to have you on this morning. So the conservative U.S. estimates are somewhere in the middle of that range, 6,000, 7,000. That, as I keep noting to folks, is the sum total of U.S. personnel losses in Iraq and Afghanistan in 20 years. So Russia facing similar personnel losses in the span of 3 weeks in Ukraine. Plus, the U.S. military, and this goes back more than a week, so you have to assume this number has come up, estimates some 10% of Russian hardware either destroyed or inoperable. Where does that leave the Russian invasion force today?
Well, Jim, it's in dire straits. I would say the Russian military has some real problems, and it really shows a difference in philosophy between American forces who try to protect their forces, their service members as much as possible, and the Russians who don't have that as part of their doctrine. Not that Russian soldiers don't want to survive, they obviously do, but these casualty rates are exceptionally high for the kind of operation that they're conducting, and it harkens back to historical battles, all the way back to World War II, when you start seeing large numbers of casualties like this. Obviously, we're nowhere near those exact totals. Those were immense totals that hit the millions during the course of that war. But in this particular case, with modern weapons and with the ability, you would think, to resupply forces under normal circumstances, this should not be happening.
Yeah.
It's also interesting, I think, CNN has just confirmed, as we noted there, one of Russia's top paratrooper commanders was killed. The fact that on Russian state TV they're talking about the deaths within that unit. What does that tell you about not only who is there in country, but the fact that this is being broadcast, I think sends an important message as well in Russia?
It does, Erica, and it's really interesting because this is couched in the Russian media as a peacekeeping mission and a denazification mission, using Putin's words. But what is really happening here is the elite forces of Russia, the parachute regiments. This would be something like losing a colonel in the 82nd Airborne Division. This is the kind of thing that really gets to the core of the professional military in Russia, and it's decimating their ranks, and it's basically a waste of their military talent.
Let me ask you this, because you can read this two ways, that this either cows Russia, right? The loss is so severe, it thinks about pulling back, or the opposite, and it pushes forward and harder and more ruthlessly. And the fact is, the latter seems to be the response so far, particularly as Russia has attacked more and more civilian targets, and then, of course, the U.S. taking the threat of a chemical weapons strike very seriously now. Where do you see, and how do you see Russia responding to this? Because folks have made the point, Putin cannot let the Russian military be embarrassed in Ukraine.
Yeah, and that's the difficulty that he's put himself in. He's basically boxed himself in, and the Russian people along with him. And so I believe the response will be, let's toughen up, let's toughen our resolve. The colonel who was killed is a hero of Russia. Therefore, we will move forward in his name. That's the kind of message that I think they will, seek to disseminate among the population in Russia. And a lot of the population is going to buy that message. They're going to see these people who have given their lives in this operation as heroes, and they are going to celebrate them, and they're going to seek vengeance.
Yeah.
We know the messaging from Ukraine far different for obvious reasons, but the president of Ukraine trying to appeal directly to Russian mothers, as we've heard in recent days, in amplifying these losses on the Russian side. What's interesting is we're not hearing a lot about Ukrainian losses, which I would think, Colonel, is also part of a very carefully planned message from Ukraine itself.
It is, and the Ukrainians are using, I think, the tenets of operational security. In other words, keep sensitive information out of the press as much as you possibly can. They're using that technique to great effect. Of course, they have some difficulty getting exact counts, I would think, of people in their service who've been killed or wounded. But on the other hand, they don't want to spread panic in their population, and they also want to make sure that nothing that they say diminishes the resolve of the Ukrainian forces and of course, the civilian population. So in this case, I think, Erica, what we're looking at is a kind of a dichotomy. On the one hand, you have them revealing a lot about what's happening with Russian forces to great effect, the Russians responding, admitting to some of these losses, the Ukrainian side not admitting to too much. And it seems as if the Russians don't have that kind of knowledge of what's happening with the Ukrainian forces, or if they do, they're not publicizing it either for whatever reason.
Yeah. Colonel Cedric Layton, I always appreciate it. Thank you.
You bet, Erica.
Still to come here, what we're learning and SAIX with the International Committee of the Red Cross. It's good to have you with us this morning. I know there were dozens of ICRC staff members and their families who were in Mariupol. They were able to get out a couple of days ago as part of a convoy. Give us a sense. What were they telling you about the situation there on the ground? Because it's very tough to get information out of Mariupol.
Well, like thousands and thousands of people, they were sheltering in different places in Mariupol. So they managed to be all together in our office, sheltering in the basement, but with little water, little food, really little supply, and in a more and more dire situation by the day. So as much as they could, they delivered all the supply that they had. So it was like about food, it was water, some tarpaulins to the city council and to different individuals. And there was an option 2 days ago to leave with a convoy the city. They managed to do so. So we are really extremely happy to know that finally they are out of the city, and we are now positioning some stock, some supply. So as soon as there is an opportunity, we can go back and help the people there.
Do you have any idea of when that may be?
Well, unfortunately, for such a thing to happen, there must be a clear agreement between the parties to the conflict, so aid can come inside the city and people can continue to go out. How are you managing with these emergencies?
We're not just talking about Mariupol, but this is, of course, across Ukraine. How are you finding that this compares to some of your work in other regions where there are still ongoing conflicts?
Well, it's to compare, but what I want to highlight is that there are some situations like the one in Mariupol that are extremely complex and extremely difficult for the people who are going through it. And there are some moments that are more positive, like today, for the second time, we were able to support the safe passage of civilians out of the city of Sumy, and of about 1,000 civilians who are now going in the direction of another city named Lubny, southwest of Sumy. So there are also positive moments when finally people manage to get out of very complex situations.
When we look at what is happening, those positive moments, as you point out, so important to highlight as well when people are getting out of those situations. More than 3 million people, 3 million Ukrainians are now refugees, right? They have left the country because of what's happening there. I know the ICRC is calling for more funding for humanitarian aid. What more would you like to see countries step up and do? What more do you feel is needed in this moment?
Well, you mentioned the people who are managing to leave the country, and there are obviously a lot of concerns for all those people to finally find a safe place and have all the things that they need most. What we see is also like inside the city, extreme needs. And I was mentioning those people who managed to leave Sumy earlier today. And you see those people, they just leave with a small bag and little supply, maybe a bottle of water, few clothes, their papers, and that's basically it. So they live with a lot of questions, with a lot of concerns about like what they are all their life they are leaving behind them, and they don't know exactly what they are going to find in the next place. So it's important to be able, of course, to support the people who are able to go outside of Ukraine. But there are also millions of people right now inside the city who continue to be in basements, sheltering, people who are on the move, people who are in collective shelters, who are displaced, people who are right now staying also in hotels, but they may also like come out of money to pay for the hotel rooms. So there are a lot of people who are currently like in great distress.
Great distress. We appreciate all of the work that you and your colleagues are doing. Florence, thank you for joining us this morning.